The most famous and the most difficult part of the Boston Marathon is this half-mile stretch known as Heartbreak Hill. Why did they call it that? Well, by the time you get there, you've already run 20 full miles. You've just come up a series of smaller hills, and right when you're tempted to think that the worst is over, that the worst is behind you, you make this little turn, and there it is. The most difficult climb of all, staring you right in the face. And that's when you feel it, heartbreak. The Bible frequently compares the life of a Christian to a race, and in a lot of ways, it's a race that's sort of like a marathon. For starters, the goal of this race is not to win. We aren't in competition against anyone else. The goal is simply to reach the finish line. The goal is to keep going. The goal is not to give up. Secondly, our race is like a marathon in that different stretches of the course are very different from one another. It's not as if we're running around a track where everything is the same. No, 1 minute it might feel as though we're running downhill with the wind at our backs. But then at another time, when we're already tired, when we're least expecting it, life takes a turn and there it is. An unbudgeted expense, a disappointing diagnosis, a rift in a very important relationship, and you feel it. Heartbreak. Thankfully, this spiritual race is one that Jesus helps us get ready for. This week, I want to talk to you about what is sort of a pivotal week in the life of Jesus, one when he started to really talk to his disciples in crystal clear terms about the difficult path that lay ahead. He told them that he would be rejected by the religious leaders, that he would suffer many things, and that he would die on a cross. And this wasn't simply what the path looked like for Jesus, it was also what the path looked like for Jesus' disciples. Jesus said that anyone who would follow him would need to be willing to take up and carry a cross of his own. That doesn't sound like a very convincing sales pitch for someone who's trying to get people to follow him, and yet it is exactly what you and I need to hear. You see, whether we're at a stretch of our race where everything is going smoothly or one where every single step is pure torture, Jesus' words keep us going because they remind us that this is the path that God has laid out. In the Psalms, King David puts it this way. He says, "When my spirit grows faint within me, it is you who know my way." Our Savior Jesus wants us to know the truth about the path that lays ahead, so that even when we experience heartbreak, we'll be able to keep going. In a world of high-speed internet, on-demand television, and Amazon Prime's 2-day shipping, we aren't very good at waiting. And it's especially difficult to be waiting for God, waiting for our prayers to be answered, waiting to hear that the treatment has worked, waiting for the strength to overcome a specific temptation. And of course, the longer you have to wait, the more difficult it gets. So you might say that Peter kind of had it easy because he only had to wait 6 days. This week, we're talking about sort of a pivotal week in the life of Jesus, one when he started to speak in crystal clear terms about the difficult path that lay ahead, not only for him, but also for his followers. And we're told that Peter didn't take the news very well. In fact, he sort of pulled Jesus aside and scolded him for daring to say such a thing. But then the path for Jesus and his disciples took them up to the top of a mountain. And there Peter saw something that he liked much better. We call it Jesus' transfiguration. Suddenly his face shone like the sun, his clothes were as white as lightning. Basically, all of the glory and majesty that Jesus possessed as the Son of God, which was normally hidden beneath his ordinary appearance, was suddenly unveiled and put on full display. And it's no wonder that Peter said what he did. He basically said, "This is what I like to see. This is good. This is where I want to stay." There have probably been times in your life when you felt like that, when the power and the presence of God just seems so obvious. Everything comes together at the last moment. A seemingly hopeless situation suddenly works out. But maybe you're still waiting. Maybe you're going through a stretch when the power and the presence of God seem miles and miles away. Either way, there's an important lesson to be learned from what Peter and the other disciples saw on that mountain. Jesus wants us to know that he possesses the full glory and majesty of God, whether we can see it or not. He wants us to know that no matter how long we wait for things to turn around, whether it's just 6 days or our entire lifetime, it still doesn't compare to what we will enjoy when the wait is over. The Apostle Paul put it this way. He said, "Our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal." Whether you're going through a stretch of your life right now where you're cruising right along, one that you hope never comes to an end, or whether you're going through one that can't end soon enough, know that none of it has escaped Jesus' notice. None of it is outside of his control, and all of it is working for your eternal good. Every parent has been asked this question at some point. The kids are having a great time at friend's house or at the park or in the pool, and so when it's time to get out and go home, they beg, they plead, "Mom, Dad, can we stay?" If you've ever been asked that question, you know that kids aren't too happy when the answer is no. So what if you're the one asking the question and Jesus is the one saying no? This week we're talking about sort of a pivotal week in the life of Jesus, one when he started to speak in crystal clear terms about the path that lay ahead for him and for his disciples. 6 days later, he took them up to the top of a mountain where all of his glory and majesty was unveiled for them to see. And it's no wonder that Peter liked what he saw so much that he basically said, "Jesus, can we stay?" Jesus' answer was no. Jesus already told them that the path ahead of him included his suffering and his death. In fact, even there on top of the mountain, there were 2 Old Testament heroes of faith who appeared, Moses and Elijah. And as they talked with Jesus, they were talking about the very same thing. And so Jesus and his disciples couldn't stay. They had to leave that mountain of glory and majesty behind. And it's a good thing that they did. Why? Well, as I'm sure you're aware, today there is a 1-syllable, 4-letter word that starts with the letter L that is on the minds of millions and millions of people all over the world. And I'm not talking about the word love, I'm talking about the word Lent. Today begins the season of the church year known as Lent with the day that we call Ash Wednesday. The ashes of Ash Wednesday are a very stark and vivid reminder of our own mortality. As God said to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and as is repeated at many funerals, dust you are, and to dust you will return. In other words, no matter how much fun we are having, no matter how much happiness we find in this life, one way or another, eventually we can't stay. The path that we are on will eventually lead us to the grave. That probably doesn't sound like a very fun thing to be talking about, especially on Valentine's Day. But here's the good news. That path that we are on is the very same one that Jesus willingly chose for us. He willingly came down from that mountain of glory and majesty so that he could climb another mountain, one of unspeakable agony, the one where he suffered and died. In fact, if you're looking for an example of love on Valentine's Day, then look no further. Jesus said to his disciples, "Greater love has no one than this, that he lay down his life for his friends." Yes, we are on a path that eventually will lead to our grave. But long before we step into that grave, Jesus willingly stepped into his. And because he did, we know that that too is a place where we won't have to stay. One of my grandpas loved telling corny jokes. Anytime we'd be driving past a cemetery, he'd turn and say, "Hey, Jonathan, how many dead people do you think there are in that cemetery?" I'd quick try and count a few headstones, do some math in my head before venturing a guess, and then he'd say, nope, it's all of them. That joke isn't any funnier now than it was when I was a kid, but the truth that is behind it is much more sobering to me with each and every passing year. Not only are all of the people in a cemetery dead, but the path for all people eventually leads to a cemetery. And doesn't that just ruin everything? If you've ever had a difficult week of work coming up, you know that it has a tendency to even ruin the weekend that comes before it. And in the very same way, our own death, if we're willing to actually face it, has a way of taking the joy out of life. How can we enjoy even a single step of the journey on our path if we know that that path eventually leads to a cemetery? This week we're talking about a pivotal week in the life of Jesus when he began to talk in crystal clear terms about the path that lay ahead for him and his disciples. He made it very clear that that path included suffering and death, but he also made it very clear that that wasn't the end. Even as he was coming down from that mountain where all of his glory had been unveiled, he said to his disciples, "Don't tell anyone what you have seen until I have risen from the dead." Yes, for us Christians, our path does eventually lead to a cemetery, but because of Jesus, that's not where the path ends. Jesus has already paved the way beyond the cemetery, and where he has gone, we will surely follow. Because of Jesus, the cemetery is not our destination. It's not the finish line. It's just a pit stop along the way. Not only does that mean that there are endless joys waiting for us, it also means that death has been completely robbed of its power to steal the joy out of life. Instead, with the Apostle Paul, we can almost taunt death because it has been robbed of its power. Paul said to the Corinthians, "Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? Thanks be to God. He gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ." There's a cemetery in a small Wisconsin town where my grandpa's body is now laid to rest. And I would love nothing more than to be at that cemetery when Jesus comes back on the last day, because I'd like to think my grandpa has one more corny joke left in him. Right after he steps out of his own grave, he'd turn to his wife and he'd say, "Helen, take a look around. How many living people do you think there are in this cemetery?" And maybe she'd look and quick try and count heads, do a little math, and then venture a guess, and he'd say, "Nope, it's all of them." Thanks be to God that that victory is ours in Jesus Christ. This just can't be right. Maybe you've thought that to yourself as you've been driving around an unfamiliar city in your car or walking through a dense forest in the dark. You look around, nothing seems familiar, everything looks a little bit off, and you think somehow you must have gotten on the wrong path. All week long, we've been talking about this pivotal week in the life of Jesus when he started to talk in crystal clear terms about the path that lay ahead for him and his followers. He told them that he would suffer and die. Then he took them up this mountain and showed them all of his glory. He told them they had to go down the mountain so that they could go to the cross, but then he told them that he would rise from the dead. As we look at this seemingly odd and bizarre path that Jesus lays out, we might be tempted to think, boy, this just doesn't seem right. Maybe you felt that way about your path too. Maybe it seems that it's so strange and so bizarre that it just can't be right. If God really does love you, if he's really in control, if you really are his child, then something seems off. Maybe you took a wrong turn. Maybe you should turn back. Maybe you should just give up. That's why it's so important that as we continue to walk our path, we also continually and repeatedly follow Jesus on his. That we follow Jesus from his birth, to his public ministry of preaching and healing, to his suffering and death, to his resurrection, and eventually to his return to heaven. It's important that we follow Jesus on his path because as we do, it also assures us of ours. The writer to the Hebrews put it this way. He said, "Let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith." Jesus is the pioneer of faith. So if our life is like a spiritual race, Jesus has already run it ahead of us. He's also the perfecter of faith. So if our life is like that race, not only has Jesus run it ahead of us, but he's finished it, he's won it ahead of us. That's why it's so important that as we live our lives, as we walk our paths, we follow Jesus as he traveled his. That way, no matter what stage of life we might be at, it's as if we can see a set of footprints in front of us. Someone has already been here. Someone has already shown where this path leads. And even when something about that path just doesn't seem right, you know who's already been here. You know where he is now, and you know where you are going.